Welcome back to Camera West TV. We're out here in the outer Richmond district in San Francisco, and we're doing a film review on CineStill's new 400D. D stands for daylight. Earlier this year, CineStill announced the introduction to their latest film stock, 400D. As many of you know, CineStill is well known for their 800T as well as their 50D and BWXX 250 film stocks. Both 800T and 50D are color negative motion picture film stocks, one daylight balanced and the other tungsten, with the remjet layer removed, resulting in a unique, unmistakable visual signature, whereas the BWXX 250 is a panchromatic black and white film that closely resembles the discontinued Kodak Plus X and TPX 320 or Kodak Tri-X Professional. These three film stocks offered a wide range for many photographers, but there was always one question in the back of my mind. Why is there no 400 speed film? Enter CineStill 400D. So my goal with this film is to kind of show off all the colors, since it is a daylight balance film, which is very different from the 800T, which is a tungsten balance film. That one's a little harder to shoot during the day. You need a warming filter or color balance it in post. So with this one, I'm excited to see what the colors look like. We have a good assortment of colors. Lots of reds, greens, some nice blues. The bridge is in the very back. So yeah, I'm excited. So we're about halfway through the roll now. So far it's been pretty bright daylight, which is like beautiful. I think I have some really nice shots of the bridge, some shots over at Legion of Honor. The lighting's very mixed over here, so there's a lot of shade mixed with, you know, bright sunlight. So I'm so loud. So the lighting here is pretty mixed. You have a lot of shaded areas mixed with a lot of bright sun, but there's like some haze overcast. So I'm excited to see how this film will handle overexposure and, you know, how CineStill is known for its halation. The other thing I'm excited about for this film is to see how the grain looks. You have 800T, which sometimes can be a little chunky when it comes to its grain structure. It is just much more light sensitive, and that comes with high speed films. Whereas their other film is a much lower speed film at 50 ISO. So you can shoot it at much lower speeds. You can slow down your shutter speed and open up your aperture to expose it really well. So you can get really creative in that aspect. So this is the first time that CineStill has made a film that is kind of in between, because before you would have to either push the 50D to 400 or you'd have to pull the 800T to 400, but then you would also have to account for the tungsten balance. So this is very exciting to see the results and see if it's comparable to Portra 400 or even Fuji Pro 400H or, you know, all the other 400 speed ISO film. Yeah, so I guess we'll see what it looks like when I get it back from the lab. So for this review, I shot 6 rolls total, 2 at box speed, 2 overexposed by 1 stop, 1 push to 800 and 1 push to 1600. So we're gonna see just how dynamic CineStill 400D actually is. And before I get into the photos, I just want to take a quick moment to thank Underdog Film Lab in Oakland, California for developing and scanning our film for today's video. They are a great film lab, they do cool stuff for the Bay Area, and please go check them out and say hi. Quick disclaimer, I did make contrast, exposure, and white balance edits to these photos. I left the colors relatively untouched. All right, so we're gonna try something a little different. I'm gonna be reviewing the photos as we go and talk about my experience with shooting them at box speed, overexposed, and the push, and kind of talk about the photos. You can also click the link down below to view all the photos. We typically have these blog posts as well on our website, so you can, you know, spend some time and really take a look at the box speed, overexposed, and the pushed rolls for yourself. So here we go. One of the first initial shots that I took was in the box speed roll, and it has a very nice color palette. Everything looks pretty soft and slightly punchy at the same time. You can kind of see that the greens really pop. The blues are a little bit more subdued. I don't think they're as saturated, but they do look pretty close to a natural sky. The shaded areas seem to have somewhat of an orangey tint and kind of a yellowy tint in the trees, like up here. So that is something that is a characteristic about this film. As I mentioned earlier, I did make some minor edits. Everything's pretty much untouched. I just tried to get the white balance as, correct as I could. Just keep going. But yeah, the greens look beautiful, and you can see here, it still holds up all this detail. It looks like in these highlight areas right here, you still have that signature halation, which is, I think, going to be a common trait for many CineStill films. As you can see in the highlights here again, we have more halation. With this being a daylight balanced film, the red in the halation isn't as distinct, and I think it actually works better for these film stocks. It looks more natural. So yeah, it really does a good job of bringing out all these like warm, vibrant colors. I think part of it has to do with just kind of like the brightness in those like hues. So maybe there's like a little bit of halation going on. So maybe that might cause some of those colors to be a little bit more punchy and poppy, but still being a little more pastel-like. It does pretty well in mixed lighting situations. You can see here that we have bright sun, subjects underneath, a shaded area. So I kind of metered for the middle ground. And then again, here you can kind of see these bright parts having a slight halation, but not too bad, which I like. And again, this is all shot at box speed. I didn't do anything special. I mean, I shot a lot of everything, mostly Sunny 16 with the help of my Voigtlander VC Meter. And then here, more, vibrant colors. So all while the red and the greens and the blues are somewhat saturated, I noticed that the yellows aren't as saturated, which is pretty unique for a color negative film. You would think that these would actually be a little bit more punchy and more vibrant, but they just seem desaturated. But that seems to be kind of the common thing here. I will say that this film has pretty good highlight retention. Even if you zoom in here, you can see that the figure still has some definitive detail all around, but it's not getting lost or drowned out by the halation or the glow. And then same thing with this, it has really good resolve when it comes to detail. You can see the bridge very far in the background, which is pretty cool. So I will say that this film does lean a little bit warmer. There was a kind of yellow warm cast that I had to kind of correct out. On overcast days like this photo or mixed lighting situations, it kind of helps make everything not as gray. But that is one thing to keep in mind when you are shooting this film. Yeah, so I think this film works really well in different situations. Here we have a very classic looking CineStill halation. You can see it very prominent in the water. I think this was a pretty good example of how the halation kind of adds to the photo. Otherwise it would just kind of be, a dark blue with no other opposing colors in the photo. So I do like that it adds to the composition of the photo. And then you can see here, it does handle highlight retention pretty well, especially in the water. Then you even have, the halation in the water. It's pretty cool. I did notice that when you aren't really metering for the shadows, they tend to look a little muddy and start kind of having that fade look. That's something that's not really my favorite look, but I do know that that is a look that some people prefer. But I do like that it does still have some detail kind of in the shadows. Here's another example of slightly underexposed, but I think at least tone-wise, it fits. And then now we're moving into some photos. These are mostly shot during Halloween weekend, so you're gonna see a lot of costumes. I know it's a little late for a film review with photos shot at Halloween, but better late than never. I also did shoot a lot of flash with this film stock. I know that the 800T film stock, you always had trouble with shooting flash just because the flash burst is a different color temperature than the film stock, so it always come out super blue. So at least with this film stock, you can treat it as you would any other color negative film and use the flash. It would be interesting to see what it would look like if you use like gels or anything, and see how those hues play out on this film stock. But I'm sure it would be pretty similar to any daylight balanced film stock. So more Halloween. So the interesting thing with using flash in this film is there are points where it doesn't show the halation. It's pretty interesting, like even in the whites of these people's costumes, well, I guess maybe a little bit here, but it's not as like prominent, which is very interesting. It's very clear that it's halating. The halations are pretty clear in the reds, which is I think going to be a pretty common thing. But yeah, I do think that this film does a very good job of bringing something different to what's already present on the film market. Let's see what else. So now we're moving into the overexposure rolls. So I shot these at 200 and had them developed at 400. So you can see there's much more shadow detail as well as highlight detail, although some of the highlights seem a little blown out. But overall, I think the exposures feel much more balanced, and that's just my personal preference. I think they have much more saturated colors and tones. I think that the highlights are nice and bright, and you have the dark and shadowy areas, you know, having a nice depth to them. They seem a little bit more full, especially with some of the contrast. So with a mixed lighting situation like this, I think the box speed rating would have just kind of made the shadows look a little bit more muddy, all while losing the brightness of the highlights, as well as some of this shadow detail that you see like on the bus stop and around the area. Here's another classic example of the halation. It's not as prominent, but this is what made me think that the reds and the greens have a slight bit of halation to them, causing them to be a little bit brighter. So, I mean, I think that's my personal guess. I could be wrong. Leave a comment down below what you think so far. And then I did notice there was a little bit of color shift here with my flash. It was very interesting. I don't know why it leaned more on the cyan teal side, but who knows? It could have just been the lighting. And then more indoor, and then more overexposure. So you can see here that it does retain really good highlight detail here. You can see all these wires coming through the window, you know, and then you still have all this detail in the shadow. And then you kind of have, you know, my reflection here on the side. So far, my favorite has been shooting it at 200. With this being a color negative film, I feel like giving it more light than it needs is much better and results in a much healthier looking negative. Get all that information in there. And then as you can see here, the halation was a little strong, so you lose a lot of the detail in, you know, the ledge over here, but you still have all the detail for this man's face and what he's doing. And then, yeah, in overcast situations, I think the tone is pretty even. You know, there's still not too much loss of detail on this map. I think it holds up pretty well. Same thing here, got a pretty light situation, especially with these dogs. You can kind of see that at least there's some separation between their background and the brightness of their fur. You see a bit of halation around their eyes, which is very interesting. All right, so moving on. Oh, and that was another thing, is indoor lighting was very interesting to see with this film. So normally with the 800T, it's tungsten balance, which is balanced for tungsten light or indoor light. Yeah, it's pretty true to what you would have for a daylight film. You know, these lights aren't balanced for outdoor, so you get a kind of green yellow hue. So we have here a pretty bright scene. This is probably my favorite photo out of the bunch, or one of my favorites. You have a pretty bright sky, which, you know, I this was such a difficult scene to meter for. You have, you know, bright sky, everything's backlit, and then you have very shadowy areas. But you can see that the halation really helps emphasize the silhouette in the signage and kind of the brightness of the photo. You still have a lot of great shadow detail here. It is a little bit grainy, but you know, it is 35mm film, so any type of grain to me is good grain. I think it's visually pleasing. It was also able to pick up these small details of like these two people on the roof. Yeah, overall, I think this film does pretty well for overexposure. Got some boxers. And then this is another scene that I think was a little difficult to meter for. You have a nice small detail with the bridge and a heart in a very like shaded area. And then you have the actual bridge in the background, which, you know, is very bright, but you still retain all that detail. You can see the cranes over in the East Bay, Oakland. So, you know, oh, you can even see a bus. Wow. Yeah, so in terms of highlight retention and shadow detail, it does a pretty good job. So now we're moving into the pushed rolls. So this is pushed to 800, so that's about one stop. So I shot this roll at 800. I do like the results. Clearly this is a very dimly lit place and I needed the extra stop to try and make some photos in here. But as you can tell, the light fixtures and the neon and the disco ball really glow and stand out, and they pop, which I think is a really good addition. So if you're gonna do some indoor like party photography, night photography, or any type of like studio work with neon lights, color gels, anything like that, you can get a really cool and unique look. So I definitely recommend experimenting and playing around with this film. I think it's one of those films that you can like treat it as normal, or you can like push it to its limits. Hence why this film was intended for dynamic versatility. So again, this is pushed to 800, and there's a little bit more contrast. It seems like the reds are a little bit more desaturated here, especially in the daytime. Although it does seem to like the purple, so I mean, you know, purple packaging, purple photo. I think it leans that way too. And as you can see here, when you push film, you get an increase in contrast as well as grain. So the film itself still looks really good, but you do notice that the shadow areas are starting to look a little bit more muddy and start to lose a little bit more detail. They kind of almost like disappear into the darkness. And then you start to notice much more pronounced grain structure, and there's not as much latitude in your image as you would see in the overexposed photos. So as you can see here, we lose a little bit more shadow detail, especially with a difficult lighting situation like this. I do think that this film does better with more light. And now this is the push to 1600 roll. As you can see here, this photo has a lot of contrast. I thought that I would be able to get whatever was on her phone screen. I think they were taking a selfie. I thought that would have been a cool composition, but I think it just gets lost in the contrast. Whereas if I shot it at 200 or 400, I think I would have had some more playroom to recover some of that shadow detail. You can almost see that her hand is almost floating and she just kind of looks like a shadowy mass. And then this is with flash. So I was shooting at f/16 at 1/50th of a second. You can kind of see the pop in their eyes and obviously in his glasses. I wanted to see if his chain here would at least like glow with the halation, but it almost seems like even in these overexposed areas up top, there isn't much like halation in the 1600 roll that I could see. As you can see here, there's significantly more contrast. Obviously with a scene like this, it's a little difficult to meter for a middle point, especially when you are pushing any type of film. You'll just kind of get more contrast and lose detail in either the shadows or the highlights. Then we have another mixed lighting situation. You start to see a loss of detail, and this bottom area is a little bit more muddy. It definitely looks a lot crunchier. Just describing the grain as much more crunchy and pronounced, especially in the detail here. It starts to look a little fuzzy, and that's just because of the increase in grain. And then here you can really see the grain, you know, especially in these shadow areas. I think it is kind of pleasing. I feel like if you were to print this photo, it would have a nice texture to it, but obviously on the screen, it kind of just looks not as pleasant. But for me, I kind of like it. So we have another indoor shot. You can see that there isn't as much shadow detail, especially compared to the 800 roll. I feel like there was still some detail that you can like pick apart. I mean, granted, this scene wasn't as brightly lit as the other one, but you know, you can definitely see on the screen that you can't even see the baseball game going on. You kind of just lose all this detail in this bottom area, as well as the side. And then it seems like when you push CineStill 400D, you tend to lose the halation. I think that's just kind of common. I mean, it's right here in the Japantown logo, but you don't really see it as much in like any of the really bright areas, except for here. This is, you know, probably one of the more prominent areas, but typically with a scene like this, you would see much more like halation present, especially with, you know, the rim lighting with the people walking around the plaza. So that is kind of interesting that obviously when you overexpose, you're gonna get the most halation, but when you underexpose and get it push processed, you kind of lose some of it. So I guess there is some trade-off here when you are underexposing or pushing your film. So again, not as much halation, also not as much shadow detail, and a lot of contrast. And these are situations where I'm shooting directly into the sun, so you have like an exposure setting of f16 and 1000. Indoor lighting looks pretty well for overexposed, you know, especially for daytime. I think it works well here. The grain isn't as prominent, so I will say if you're like indoors and you're in a pinch, definitely push it. You can get some cool results. But clearly this right here is a exposure error on my part. I definitely think I could have, you know, maybe opened up the lens a little bit or slowed down the shutter speed. But, you know, I do think that it is one of those situations where you have to think about what you want to expose for. For here, I think I was just mostly going with the bright areas, but you do lose a lot of shadow detail. Another situation like that, you lose significant amount of shadow detail, especially if you're trying to save your highlights. And then I also tried some portraits with my friend Corey. I do think that it looks really good. I would just say that when you get in closer, obviously it gets very grainy, a little crunchy looking, so it is one of those photos where it looks better from afar. Same thing here, it was the same exposure, so it looks really good, but then when you get up close, it looks pretty crunchy. And then to see it handle kind of like fluorescent lighting or whatever, you know, this kind of lighting is, I think is pretty cool. This is probably one of the only photos where I saw the halation really like stand out and kind of add to the photo, especially while I was shooting the 1600 roll. I do like what it does for this photo. Kind of makes it feel like we are looking at a movie. It has almost like a kind of like an Ocean's 11 type feel. And this was the last photo on the 1600 roll, and I purposely shot this last one in a very contrasty scene. I do think that this film does excel in a lot of different ways, especially with the intended use. So whether you want to push or pull, or however you want to treat this film, the dynamic versatility that this film is built with in mind, I think really stands out. So good job, CineStill. I really like how this film performs. All right, let's stop screen recording here. According to CineStill, 400D is specifically designed for still photography and C41 processing, and is not simply repackaged motion picture film with the remjet layer removed, much like the 800T and the 50D. This new film was specially developed and is based on advanced technology found in motion picture emulsions, all while delivering features exclusive to still photography. All of this is to say that in the year 2022, CineStill has found a way to develop, produce, and manufacture a brand new 400 speed, color negative, daylight balanced film stock. That's a lot to say. My final thoughts on this film is that it's extremely versatile. And that's also to say that most color negative films are pretty versatile. Portra 400, for example, is one of those films where you can utilize it in so many different ways. But there's films like Ultramax where it's not as versatile, but you can still get away with a lot with those films. And that's not to say that I prefer one over the other. I just think you could use either film for a very specific use. But anyway, back to this film. I do enjoy this film. In my honest opinion, I would probably use this film on special occasions, or if I was going for that stylized look. I know that the halations aren't for everyone, and sometimes even for me, I do think they're a little distracting. I do think that it's a really cool tool that you can incorporate to your photos if you can use it really well. And also this film has a lot of exposure latitude, whether you're overexposing or underexposing. So I do think that it does live up to its name. So one of my only gripes with this film was the kind of yellow warm undertone that this film kind of had on some of the photos. I think it worked in some instances, but in other cases, I did think it was a little distracting. That could just be the case with old scanners and a new color profile, so maybe you would just have to do a little bit of color correcting in post. But I will say that overall, I really enjoyed this film, and I definitely see myself using it more often in the future, especially if more film stocks continue to disappear over time. For those of you who haven't shot film in a while or don't follow along with the film news, color negative film stocks have been getting discontinued left and right. Some of our favorites are just not even available anymore, or simply just not as attainable as they used to be. So for CineStill to come out with a brand new color negative film stock, let alone a 400 speed film stock, I think is a big win for the film community, and is a great way to add one more option to the already dwindling color negative film list. They also offer it in 120, and I believe they have it for a large format options as well. So it's really cool to see CineStill bring in an all new line of 400 speed specific color negative film. So anyway, let me know down below in the comments what you think of CineStill 400D. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this new film stock. I think moving forward with film stocks becoming more and more limited, it is refreshing to see that a company like CineStill is making new film stocks in the year 2022. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know what you think about CineStill 400D. Hopefully we can do more film reviews like this. But also let me know what you think about this format for a film review. I was trying something different, so I'd love to hear what you have to say. And once again, I'm Carlo from Camera West TV. Thanks for watching.